Hello, I'm Ken Follett, and I'd like to tell you about my new novel, Never. Never takes place in the present, but it was inspired by events that happened more than 100 years ago. Studying the path that led to the First World War while writing Fall of Giants, I was struck by the fact that no national leader actually wanted a European war in 1914. Yet, each of the emperors and prime ministers took small, quite rational steps that cumulatively led to what was up to that point the worst war the human race had ever known. And that led me to ask, could it happen again? Leaving aside the possibility of nuclear war by accident, or nuclear war started by a mentally unbalanced American president, could reasonable, moderate men and women find themselves dragged against their will into World War III? I see 4 stages on the path to war: the spark, the escalation, the existential threat, and the commitment. Everyone knows about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria, by a Bosnian nationalist at Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914. That was the spark that lit the fire. And my first task in writing Never was to consider what might be the flashpoint leading to World War III. I put this question to several people with experience of international affairs at a high level, who were kind enough to give me interviews. Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, European First Minister Baroness Ashton, Cathy Ashton, Sir Kim Darroch, who was the UK ambassador to Washington until he fell foul of President Trump. A flashpoint is a place where a conflict could involve the major powers, and there's no shortage of possibilities. Some examples: Ukraine, Strait of Hormuz, Kashmir, Taiwan, South China Sea. What happens in Never is that the world leaders of the USA, China, and several other countries successfully negotiate a number of minor crises until there's one that has longer-term effects. Back in 1914, Emperor Franz Joseph felt he had to punish Serbia, a weak and subservient satellite of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he declared war on Serbia. This was the first step in the ladder of escalation. The declaration of war on Serbia alarmed the Russians. Serbia was part of that Balkan region that neighboured both Austria and Russia, and encroachment into this zone by either side was seen as aggressive. So Tsar Nicholas II mobilized the Russian army. It was not a declaration of war. No one died. The Tsar did not think he had started a conflagration, but this was the second step up the ladder. And it's all too easy to see how, in our time, this kind of thing can occur again. The Canadians arrest the CFO of Hawaii, so the Chinese arrest 2 Canadians and charge them with espionage. The Americans step up sanctions on Iran, so the Iranians seize an oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. The US 6th Fleet bombards a village in Lebanon, and Hezbollah bombs the Marine Corps barracks in Beirut. Sometimes political leaders refrain from retaliation, but they generally get no thanks from their voters who want their country to look strong. Now consider the position of the German Kaiser in 1914, as 3 million Russian soldiers began to assemble on Russia's borders with Germany and with Austria. The Kaiser had to mobilize the German army. Indeed, for the Kaiser not to have done so would have been a dereliction of duty amounting to treason. But that was another escalation. That was not enough for Germany. The German High Command believed they could defeat either Russia or France, but not both. The German government asked the French for a pledge of neutrality in the event of a war between Germany and Russia. But France had a defence treaty with Russia, a treaty that would be violated by a promise of neutrality. Treaties can always be broken, but it was clearly in France's interests to keep an ally as powerful as Russia. So the French Prime Minister, René Viviani, refused, point blank, to give the Germans the assurance they demanded. For Germany, this was an existential threat, a threat to the very existence of their country, which, remember, was only 43 years old. And this is a key moment. Mere tension becomes actual danger. So the commitment came quickly. Germany invaded France, and apocalypse arrived. There's a similar moment in Never. I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but I'll say that the leader of one country says, "My country is on the point of being wiped out. I will certainly be murdered. I have nothing to lose. I will release the most terrible weapons at my disposal." The heart of my novel, Never, and the most fascinating aspect for me is the middle, the way the crisis escalates. How do moderate, centrist leaders make decisions that lead to catastrophic war? Why did Japan's leaders in 1941 attack the richest, most powerful nation in the history of human civilization? How did President Lyndon Johnson slowly and inexorably become entangled in Vietnam, ruining his reputation? How could Tony Blair be so foolish as to involve the United Kingdom in a war being organized by George W. Bush, the most ignorant and incompetent American president for 100 years? I don't know the answers, of course, but I offer a different way to shed light on these questions. The novelist, with his fictional characters, has permission to imagine the interior emotions and thought processes of men and women who make world-changing decisions. In Never, there's a parallel between Washington and Beijing. Both leaders, smart, well-intentioned people in my story, are trying to walk a tightrope. The American president, a Republican, struggles to avoid war while defending herself against gung-ho nationalist attacks from her rival in the primaries. The Chinese president is a progressive by inclination, but hampered by the hardline communists who hold ultimate power. Most national leaders share the problem of combating extreme views within their own political base, including, for example, Boris Johnson with the conservative old guard and Joe Biden, who has the Bernie Sanders left-wing faction to contend with. In democracies, leaders must respond to public opinion. People hate their country to look weak, and this pressure nudges leaders into decisions somewhat riskier than their inclinations. But for a while, each of these decisions falls short of being fatal. Franz Joseph's declaration of war on Serbia did not have to threaten Russia. The Tsar and the Kaiser could have reached a modus vivendi. But eventually one of those decisions comes to seem existential. In 1914, it must have seemed to the Germans that France and Russia were going to crush them in an east-west nutcracker. And the prosperous nation they'd created in the last half-century might just disappear, as Poland had. And in such circumstances, nations take risks. The Kaiser did not want war, but if it was going to happen, he wanted to fight it on his own terms, and so he invaded France. But once again, the national leaders made decisions that seemed to them sensible, perhaps inevitable, and the result was 4 years of slaughter on a scale they'd never imagined. And that's how my story develops. A series of minor conflicts, one of which is more dangerous than usual, a gradual escalation as every action causes a slightly more violent reaction, an existential moment when one or more countries feels its very existence is at stake, and then the ultimate decision whether or not to start a nuclear war. I'm not going to tell you whether nuclear war actually happens in Never. When you read the book, you won't know until the very last page. And then, when you know the ending, I ask you please not to tell anyone.
Hello everyone, I'm Francesca Cartier Brickell, and this is just to say I'm so pleased that the Cartiers has now been published in Romanian as Familia Cartier. So this was the English version, and this is the Romanian one, which is just out, and it's a first foreign edition, so I'm very excited. And I'd like to thank all the team at RAO for their hard work, because they made it a truly beautiful edition that's exceeded my expectations. This book all kicked off when I discovered a trunk of long-lost family letters in my grandfather's cellar just over 10 years ago. And as you can see, when you open the first page of the book, the idea is when I discovered this trunk of letters, I was overwhelmed when I opened it and saw all the letters inside. I wasn't expecting that. And as you open the book, it's to give you a sense of that same feeling of what I felt. Here, a selection of all the letters inside. And yes, so in a way it makes sense that this Romanian was the first edition, because obviously Queen Maria of Romania was one of the most important Cartier clients in the early years of the 20th century. And there's a photograph of her in here in her Cartier jewels. So yes, I hope you enjoy it. It's a book that is very close to my heart because it contains stories that my late grandfather, Jean-Jacques Cartier, used to tell me and my family over the lunch table. Very kind of personal family stories. It's a book about the people behind the jewels, 4 generations of one family. So yeah, I hope very much you enjoy it. Thank you very much, and yeah, take care.
Hello, I'm Mackintosh-Smith. I'm the author of the book Arabs, A 3,000-Year History of Peoples, Tribes and Empires. And I'm thoroughly delighted to know that it's come out in the Romanian language. That's a great treat for me. It's the first of my books that's come out in Romanian, so I'm really quite excited. Now, I admit it's a big book, it's a heavy book, it's a fat book, and that's because it does cover these 3,000 years. And there are a lot of people in it, a lot of places, a lot of time. So it's kind of physically a heavy book. But I tried to make it a good read. And I hope it's a good read in Romanian. I can't tell. I wish I could. Having studied Latin, I can actually understand bits of it. But no, I'm sure it's a good read in Romanian too. And well, I just wanted to tell you a bit about the writing of it. At the moment, I'm in Muscat, the capital of Oman, but I wrote the book in my home, which is usually Sana'a, the capital of Yemen. And I wrote it in my beautiful old house in the middle of the old city. It's an old house in itself, but actually it's built on the ruins of the Abbasid governor's palace, which was there about 1,300 years ago. And underneath that palace, somewhere, are the ruins of the capital city of Sheba, Sabah, which appears in the Bible, of course, the Queen of Sheba. And one of her capital cities is underneath my house. So my house where I wrote this book is actually built on a lot of history. And I wrote it in the middle of the war, which sadly, very, very sadly, tragically, is still going on there. I wrote the book with the missiles coming in the middle of explosions, losing people I knew, people who were dear to me. So I wrote it in the middle of history. What I'm trying to say is it's a book which is written on the ruins of the past, and it's surrounded by the ruins of the present. So it's founded on history and it's surrounded by history. It's full of history. But history, of course, is only another word for stories. It's stories about people across time. And I just hope I've been able to tell those stories well, and that they come across in an interesting way in Romanian as well. And once again, I can tell you, I'm really excited that it's out in the Romanian language. I just wish I could read it myself. So I can't, but I can say happy reading to you.
Un târg de carte, fie și online, este un eveniment fantastic și salut LibFest și vă felicit din toată inima. Sunt Mihai Malaimare și am onoarea să fiu publicat de către editura RAO. Salutări tuturor celor care veți participa la acest târg și mai cu seamă celor care veți avea bucuria ca urmare a acestei călătorii virtuale să vă întâlniți cu cartea favorită în format real. Cu dragoste tuturor! Salut tuturor! Vă invit să faceți o excursie. IATC București, 1969-1973. O generație care a intrat spectaculos în institut, o generație care a muncit la fel de spectaculos, alături de niște profesori fantastici, Monica Lerter, Zoe Anghelstanca, Geta Angheluță, profesorii mei, dar George Demlogin, Bibanu, Adriana Piteșteanu, profesorii colegilor noștri de la clasa paralelă, să aflați cum trăiam, cum munceam, cum simțeam, cum construiam propriul nostru viitor. Atunci vă invit să citiți Caleașca aurită. Am scris-o cu sufletul. O concertina la care n-am cântat niciodată, o concertina care a aparținut unui foarte bun prieten, Marcelino, unul din cei mai interesanți clovni ai Circului de Stat din București, a cărui poveste se găsește în această carte, Actorul, bufonul, clovnul. Eu însumi am fost clovn, am scris spectacole pentru clovni, am regizat spectacole de clovni, am jucat în spectacole de clovni în Franța, la audiențe de 5-6 mii de oameni pe seară. Vorbesc despre o familie a creatorului, a suferitorului de teatru, actorul. Iar mai jos, doi veri buni. Bufonul, care a trăit cam vreo 6 secole, e ceva absolut colosal, și clovnul, care este mai tânăr, e cel mai tânăr și unul dintre cele mai interesante personaje ale istoriei teatrului universal. Actorul, bufonul, clovnul. E cartea care încearcă să spună că am scris o lucrare de doctorat cândva care se numea Clovnul depozitar de teatralitate. Vă îmbrățișez.